Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Xoogler session with Singapore's Economic Development Board. My name is Chris Fong. I started the Xoogler community back in 2015. It's initially put to help startup founders, and with so many more influx of new members, we're essentially helping Xooglers with different professional endeavors after they leave Google. Thank you for joining this conversation, whether you were impacted by Google, whether you want to be an entrepreneur, or you just want to possibly join all of us in Singapore as you consider your next professional journey. I have to thank Kim from Sequoia Capital. She's a Xoogler herself, but also a former Singaporean. She could still be Singaporean, for introducing me to Jeffrey Chia. Jeffrey is the regional director of EDB's office based out of San Francisco. And after some conversations a few months ago, he's introduced me to a few different of his colleagues, his ex-colleagues. Essentially, as you can imagine, with Singapore's push to recruit a lot of great talented people, he's got Sean as his colleague to actually have this conversation with all of you. And I think there's a lot of opportunities for you to perhaps follow up, whether with the two people we have today, but also perhaps with others that are on their teams, to see whether you want to move your next stage, whether it's to stay in Singapore or to move to Singapore. So it's a bit of introduction. Sean Lowe is going to be our main speaker. He'll present a few slides and be open to Q&A. He's the Vice President of Singapore Businesses for EDB and also the Vice President of Human Capital. He's been there for just over a year, but he's been in many different roles within Singapore's government, whether it's at the Ministry of Manpower, also helping to set education policy in the Ministry of Education. He studied in both the UK as well as the US, and has also had some experience in industry. So he has great qualifications to share more about what it could be like moving to Singapore from overseas, as well as answer any questions you have about industry, but also what is Singapore set up for you to perhaps apply for different passes, what perhaps are tech policy and different policies that Singapore has to welcome all of you to either start your own business or perhaps to join a company here or to change companies if you're impacted by Google in Singapore. Without further ado, Sean, can I turn over to you, perhaps make your introduction and we can start going through the slides. And I'm happy to present the slides if that's preferable.
Yes, thanks, Chris. Can you hear me?
Can hear you, yeah.
Fantastic, fantastic. A very good morning, everyone, and good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Sean, and Chris introduced me briefly, but it is in the capacity of being the Vice President of Human Capital that I'm here today. And at EDB, my job is to help the best global talent come to Singapore to work with the best local talent that we have, to help grow businesses, as well as scale up companies in Singapore. And with that as an introduction, I'm glad to meet the community and really glad that Chris has brought us all together to have this sharing. I'll share a couple of slides where I want to cover a few points. The first point that maybe for those who are not yet in Singapore is really give you an introduction about the country, the city and the economy. And the second point would then be about the ways in which if you're overseas, you can come here to live and work. And if you're in Singapore, the other options for you to explore other opportunities as well. Now let me try to share my slides. Oh, Chris, I think only you are allowed to share the slides.
Sure. Sorry
as
about
a host.
And then Jeff, you are
okay
as well. I can try to share if needed to.
Let me try. That's okay. I've got it here.
Well, I think we're all still used to Google Meet, so Zoom sometimes is a bit of a new experience for all of us. So thank you.
Yeah. Can you see the slides?
It's perfect. Thank you.
Perfect. Great. Okay, I'll cover this quite quickly and then we can have enough time afterwards for the Q&A. And please feel free to ask any questions you might have about Singapore, about the opportunities here. I'll start by talking a bit about the country. We are one of the global talent hubs that you have in the world. For those of you who are in Singapore already, I hope you had a good experience. For those who are not in Singapore yet, I think you may have heard of Singapore and about the opportunities we give to the best and the brightest around the world. There are a few reasons why I say that we are a global talent hub. The first one is that we are emerging stronger after the pandemic. We are increasingly attractive to all types of global talent all around the world. I was just having a chat with someone else this morning, and that person came from a recruitment agency, and he was sharing with me that actually Singapore is emerging stronger compared to when Singapore entered the pandemic. And the reasons were primarily because, one, on the public health side, we managed to successfully get through the pandemic with minimal loss of life. So public health outcomes were very good in Singapore. And the second one was that businesses kept on operating. Supply chains kept on being open. And for the companies that had set up in Singapore and for the startup founders that founded startups before COVID, they managed to continue with operations through the pandemic. And so that's why in the last 9 months or so, we've seen an increase in interest from global talent around the world to come to Singapore to either work or to set up businesses. You also recall that Singapore is in the midst of a high growth region. Fundamentally, we are in the middle of Southeast Asia with close to 600, 700 million people and $1 trillion economy. I think the opportunities here for businesses are because of a large and growing middle class that is not yet fully digitally native, but has the opportunity to be so in the next decade or two. In terms of livability, if you want to travel, and I think many of us here like to travel, it's a very accessible place. So Chris, are you calling in from Singapore or from Malaysia? I was looking at your LinkedIn.
Right now, I'm in Kuala Lumpur. I flew in on Monday from Singapore.
That's right. You're at Kuala Lumpur now, and it's what, 1 hour from Singapore?
Yep.
Yeah. So I think Chris is also enjoying the benefits of being based out of Singapore. Recently, we were ranked the second most competitive country for global talent, and we are the most competitive city in the Asia Pacific. And beyond the opportunities, I think what I want to share a bit about Singapore is about how livable and how lovable we are trying to become. Not many people know this, but we are a city in nature. We used to be called the Garden City, where we would set up like parks and gardens around the city. But now we want to think of ourselves as a city in nature, where we are nature first and a city second. And the healthcare system is world class, and we just got through COVID, so I won't speak too much about this. And the quality of our education system, both for your children, as well as for the Singaporeans who go up through the education system, is world class, it's top notch. We have some of the best international schools in Singapore. Our national system of schools is recognized globally for being one of the best in the world. And therefore, the Singaporeans that you work alongside, whether it's in tech type of jobs, or actually all across the economy, are very highly trained, highly motivated, and aspiring to be world class. In the next part of my presentation, I'll then share a bit more about the passes that we have for global talent like yourselves to consider coming to Singapore to live and work. There are two categories of passes. The first pass on the left is our go-to pass for expatriates like yourselves. And then the other group of passes on the right are passes that we give to individuals. Now, the difference is that for the pass on the left, the employment pass, this is a pass that is employer sponsored, which means that you have to have a job first before you come to Singapore. It's the pass that the majority of global talent and global expatriates are on. It's very similar to the passes that you see in the US, the UK, and other parts of the world, where you need an employer to apply on your behalf. And once you get the offer and you get the pass, then you can come into Singapore. Typically, it's for 2 years, and it can go up to 3 years for every renewal period. I'll cover the details in the subsequent slides. But just briefly on the right-hand side, these are passes that we give to individuals. So they don't need to be sponsored by a single employer, although some individuals on these passes are also working for employers. But it's really on the merit of the individual's application that we consider giving some of these passes on the right-hand side. Moving on, in terms of the employment pass, that first pass that I mentioned, these are the broad parameters that we provide all companies. The numbers here are in Singapore dollars, but you can convert it to US dollar quite easily. Typically, the minimum requirement to get one of these employment passes is to get a job that offers you something slightly above 4,200 US dollars on a fixed monthly basis, excluding bonuses and excluding some of the reimbursements that the company might pay. At the same time, in order to get one of these employment passes, the companies in Singapore have to advertise for the job and fairly consider Singaporeans for at least 14 days. So this is what we call the fair consideration requirement. Please feel free to also add any questions to that. I think, Chris, you can help curate the questions and we can have a bit of like Q&A after that. In terms of other passes that some global talents consider to take on when they come to Singapore, depending on their aspirations, there are a few. The first one is what we call the Entree Pass or the Entrepreneurship Pass. Now, this is catered to those who want to start businesses from scratch from Singapore. For this pass, you can come in. You don't have to have a salary requirement. You don't have to have an employer. You do have to have a business plan. So it's not just an idea. You do have to have a business plan. And we give it on a 1-year renewable basis. Each year when you try to renew, there are slightly higher renewal requirements that are usually tagged to the hiring of Singaporeans and the spending of your startup in Singapore. So this first pass, the Entree Pass, is meant for you if you want to come and start a business. Now the second one, the PEP or the Personalized Employment Pass. This is one where we give it to those who might have slightly higher incomes. From September this year, it's 22,500 Singapore dollars on a fixed monthly basis. And this is what we call a look-see pass, which means it's non-renewable. You can come here for up to 2 to 3 years. It's based on your last drawn fixed monthly salary. And the idea is for you to come to Singapore to take a look, to explore opportunities and different employers, while at the same time not being under too much pressure to be tied to a single employer. So this threshold, and you see this coming up quite a bit, of 22,500, corresponds to our 90th percentile of all employment pass holders in Singapore, which means 10% of global expatriates in Singapore earn above this fixed monthly salary of 22,500. The third pass is a tech pass. Now, this is a pass that my team at EDB created and that we administer. So unlike the other passes that I described, and maybe the next pass, which are primarily administered by the Ministry of Manpower, the tech pass is administered by the Economic Development Board. And the reason for this is because we have a closer relationship with some of our tech pass holders to encourage them to scale up their startups in Singapore. Unlike the Entree Pass, the first pass I had explained, this one has a higher bar. It requires you to have a lot of experience in leading roles in tech companies, either founding them yourself or by taking a leading role in one of the largest tech companies in the world. So for example, for Google, what I look for, what my team looks for, are those who have experience in Google level 7 jobs and above. In addition, you have to meet other criteria, and that's on the slide. All these slides will be shared later, and I can feel free to share them with the community. Yeah, once Jeff cases, go ahead. Finally, the last pass I wanted to share with you, and it's a new one that we just launched last month, is the Overseas Networks and Expertise Pass, or the One Pass for short. This is the most flexible pass that we have. It's also the one with the highest bar, where we use it to support top-tier global executives, not just in the tech sector, but in all other industries, to come to Singapore with a longer assurance of stay, and with the assurance that their spouse is able to work because of this sponsorship. In other passes, in order for your spouse to work, that spouse has to qualify for a work pass on his or her own merit. However, for the One Pass, and actually the Tech Pass as well, the training spouse can work in Singapore without a separate work pass. So this last pass is really for top-tier candidates around the world. Finally, in my last part before we go into Q&A, There are some schemes that we also have to support companies to scale up in Singapore, and this might be relevant for those who are going to found startups and who want to then headquarter them or to grow them in Singapore. The first program that we run is called the Tech at SG program. It's for startups that have funding of at least 10 million US dollars or above. And what it does is that it allows a startup to hire more employment pass holders with significantly greater assurance. I can't say 100%, but close to 99%, you would be able to get your employment passes that you apply for. And we support the first 10 employment passes on this. At the same time, my colleagues and I also will support you and your startup with a host of programs that we have in Singapore for local talent, local Singaporean talent, where we have scholarships, where we co-fund some of the wages that you might pay for Singaporean talent in order for them to have the opportunity to work with you to grow alongside your company. The last few slides are more for employers, but I just thought I'd cover it briefly, that the jobs that employers want to hire employment pass holders for will need to be advertised in a central platform for at least 14 days. And in Singapore, like many places in the world, we make sure that employers avoid discriminatory hiring practices. So on the basis of age, race, religion, or nationality, we are quite strict about hiring individuals only from a certain nationality or certain race. From September this year, we're going to have new frameworks in place to help improve the transparency and accessibility of our Work Pass framework. I'm not going to go through this slide, but I just thought to highlight a few points here, which are indicated from C1 to C6 on the chart. And that's a way in which we are holistically assessing each employment pass candidate going forward, where we're not just looking at salary, which is C1, or qualifications, which is C2, but also whether the employer has a diverse profile of workers in its firm, and whether the employer also supports locals or Singaporeans in the firm. In jobs where there are shortages in Singapore, we also provide bonus points. So this is like a way in which we assess every employment pass application from September onwards. The point here being that beyond wage, we're going to look at each application more holistically. And this is the same thing that I mentioned, that above 22,500, which is the 90th percentile, employers don't necessarily have to advertise, and they don't necessarily have to go through the holistic framework, but it's all pegged to that same salary threshold from September 2023. So that's clearer for employers and for individuals like yourselves. With that, I come to the end of my presentation. I want to thank my colleagues on the call also for putting the deck together, and I'm happy to take any questions as well. Chris, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sean. I know a lot of folks who have joined from the Google Singapore office, and a few of them are on gardening leave right now. So there's sort of two related questions. I'll read through both of them, and perhaps you can help answer them in total. So the first one was posted in the Dory. Do I need to stay in Singapore during my gardening leave? If I move back home, where will I receive the balance payments, and will they be taxed? Can I apply for my PEP after my gardening leave gets over? And can I and my dependents stay in the country while I wait for it to process? Do I need to inform the school, etc., that I have been laid off, or can I wait till the gardening leave period? So let me also ask the other question that's very similar in some ways. If we're on EP now at Google, then taking up a new opportunity in Singapore and qualify for PEP, aka now making 12K a year, a month, does the new employer apply for the PEP for us? Or do they just apply for an EP and then we apply for a PEP afterwards?
Yeah, thanks for the questions. I'll answer them in turn. First, for those who are formerly on employment passes in Singapore, most recently, the Ministry of Manpower worked with my team to extend the time that you have in Singapore after your employment pass is revoked or taken away. It used to be 30 days, but now it's 90 days. So what would happen is that when Google informs the Ministry of Manpower to rescind the employment pass, you get a 90-day short-term visit pass, if I'm not wrong, where you can continue to stay in Singapore to settle what you need to settle, to find a new opportunity if you would like to, and to settle the issues relating to your children's schools and all. At the same time, this window is one in which, if you qualify, you can consider applying for the PEP. The PEP is an individual pass, so the employer does not apply for the PEP for you. You have to apply for yourself, and you can apply through the Ministry of Manpower website.
So maybe the clarification. Ari, do you want to unmute and ask your question directly?
Go ahead. Yes, please. I had trouble looking at the link, but please feel free to send your questions to Chris, and then I'll leave Chris to decide which one to answer.
Sure. Ari, do you want to try to unmute?
I wasn't asking a question. I was just answering Anderson's about PEPs.
Sure. Okay.
I don't have a question. Sorry.
No worries. Great. So why don't we just go into the other Dory-related questions, Sean? Thank you. So Brendan's asking, how easy is it for a company based in Singapore to hire a foreigner and provide work visa EP? Do they tend to hire local first? If yes, what are the main reasons?
Yes. So it depends on the type of company and the stage in which a company has a presence in Singapore. For companies that are entirely new to Singapore, which means they've barely been incorporated in Singapore, they've not yet hired their first employee, usually we scrutinize the applications a bit more closely. What I've seen is that a lot of the new companies, they will definitely try to hire a Singaporean first. Oftentimes, it's the Singaporean GM who then builds the team from Singapore. If such of these companies have projects that are with EDB, or who have contacts with EDB and they're talking about how they can expand in Singapore, what we try to do is we try to look at the applications and make sure that they are not unnecessarily rejected. So those are for the new companies. There's a second group of companies that are established companies with a clear established presence in Singapore. Typically, these companies have more than 20 employees. And they're subject to the usual fair consideration rules. Because for companies that are a bit smaller, they're not subject to the same fair hiring requirements that larger companies are subject to. Because we understand that small companies, it's a bit difficult to scale. It's difficult to impose such requirements on such small companies. But for established companies, typically with employment sizes of something more than 20 or 25, they're subject to fair hiring rules, which means they have to advertise for each vacancy in a central platform and consider Singaporeans fairly before offering an employment pass to anyone else. So whether it's easy or not, I think depends on the company. I can say though, that the processing time and speed of getting an employment pass has been significantly accelerated. So now, about 90% of employment passes are processed and either approved or rejected within 3 weeks. The majority of them are actually done within 10 days. And what I've heard companies tell me in the last 3 to 6 months is that it's easier to get, it's faster, not say it's easier, it's faster to get an employment pass than it is to get a bank account open in Singapore for the new startups. So usually it's not that difficult if your candidate meets the criteria, and if you're an established company, you've fairly considered Singaporeans.
Sounds like we need some startup founders to work on starting up bank accounts here in Singapore to match the
I think that's a problem statement that has yet to be solved, Chris.
Yeah. So let's talk about the other PEP related questions. Can we work part-time in multiple companies with PEP? And what are the chances of PEP being approved, assuming we meet the qualifiers? Yeah. This will help plan trips in and out of Singapore during these unforeseen times.
Yeah, thanks. So for the PEP, I understand it that it's for it to be a flexible pass. I can't recall whether or not you're allowed to take on multiple roles. I do believe you can, but I'll have to get back to you so that I don't factually give you the wrong statement. But my recollection is that you can take on multiple roles. It's also not tied to an employer. So if you want to move from one employer to another employer, you have the ability to do so. You can take on consultancy roles. I see a question on consultancy roles as well. And because the PP is based on a minimum criteria, which is almost entirely objective, as long as you meet that minimum criteria, usually the Ministry of Manpower would approve it. And that minimum criteria is based on wage. You have to, however, provide the necessary documents to demonstrate that you've earned that wage in the past.
So if anyone has questions, clarification questions, feel free to unmute or raise your hand. I know this is a very important question for a lot of people who are thinking about doing part-time, but also consulting work. So feel free to share that. And so there's also the questions about what are the chances of PEP being approved, assuming we meet the qualifiers. This will help plan trips in and out of Singapore during these unforeseen times. Any other reassurances?
Yeah, so the chance of it being approved, Chris, I think it's pretty high if they meet the criteria that is on the Ministry of Manpower website, because the PEP criteria is almost entirely objective. So it's just based on salary and your previous employer.
Okay.
And once you get the PEP, I think the ability to move in and out of Singapore should be quite smooth.
So why don't we go to some raised hands in case those raised hands are related to the question. I think Pooja shows up first. Pooja, you want to raise your hand if it's related to these topics?
Yeah, so it's not directly related to only PEP, but what I wanted to understand, Sean, and thank you so much for the presentation first, is that like we were discussing on the chat here, if a bunch of us Xooglers, probably in different parts of the world, some in Singapore, some elsewhere, 10, 12 of us, we want to come together and probably start a new company, solve a new problem, sitting in Singapore, solve a problem for the world or maybe problem for Singapore or other Asian countries. And so if we were to take that route, what are some of the support options that we can sort of get or explore? It might be a part of your PEP or other visa options, or I don't know, are there fund support, or are there any other ways in which the body can help?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So if you want to come and start a business in Singapore, and I think Singapore is always welcoming individuals who want to help us solve problem statements. The best way to come to Singapore is to apply for an entree pass, an entrepreneurship pass. That will allow you to spend 1 year in Singapore growing your business. To apply for this pass, you still, however, have to submit a business plan, and that would be assessed by the Ministry of Manpower as well as by my colleagues at the Enterprise Singapore department.
Right.
Now,
and what are the
if you successfully come to Singapore and they allow you to come to Singapore to found a startup, then we have a whole ecosystem that enables startups to grow in Singapore. And it really depends on the startup that you're having and the factors of production that you need to grow the startup. By factors of production, I mean land, labor, capital, and less so for startups, but sometimes they also need a carbon budget if it's a manufacturing startup. Now, for land and labor, we have flexibilities that we offer to help startups have a slightly lower cost of scaling at the start. And there are parts of Singapore which are zoned to help startups scale from there. I see the second part of the question, which is what happens if you want to start the business in Singapore, but you're not physically in Singapore. I think that can be done as well. And I think you just need one member of your team to be based in Singapore to grow the team. If you're completely remote, if you're completely remote, that's also fine. So you're incorporating a company in Singapore, but you're not actually working in Singapore, so you don't need a pass for that.
Right. And is there a monetary angle to it, like a minimum investment we need to do or something on those lines, or how much revenue we need to make? Are there like filters for those, or can we start fresh?
You can start fresh, but in the business plan, I think they will ask for some of your projections. What I believe my colleagues look out for are two factors. The first factor is the hiring plan. And the second factor is the expenditure plan, because they do look at total business spending in Singapore.
Understood.
Yeah.
Sure. Very, very helpful, Sean. Thank you.
Maybe
My
we'll go to
pleasure.
Brandon, unmute.
Oh, hey, yeah, thank you, Sean. Is it advised for EP holders to always apply for PEP whenever it's qualified? It seems like you are at flexibility and benefits.
If I get the question correctly, you're asking me whether it always makes sense to apply for the PEP.
Yeah. Whenever you are qualified, when you're holding an EP, when you are qualified for PEP, do you always should go for it?
Yeah. So the answer is that it depends, because the first problem of the PEP, or the first characteristic of the PEP by design, is that it's non-renewable and it lasts only 2 to 3 years. So because it's non-renewable and it lasts only 2 to 3 years, usually it should be there only if you want to explore new opportunities or work for different employers, or if you are overseas and not yet in Singapore, and you want to come to Singapore first without getting an employer. Because it's non-renewable, so you can only have it once. You can't have the PEP and continue to renew the PEP after that.
I see, that makes sense. Thank you.
Most welcome. Are there any other questions about the PEP? I sense that there's a lot of interest about the PEP here.
I think it's PEP and EP. Maybe Stephanie, do you want to unmute and ask your question? Or I can read it out if you prefer.
It might be easier to read it out since I'm in a very noisy place.
No worries. Thank you, Stephanie. And Sean, I think a lot of folks who have kids have had a similar question. So how fast does the EP convert to STVP after the garden leave period ends? What considerations are there if one of my dependents out of Singapore when EP converts to STVP, as in she has a son, wants to spend the summer with the grandparents out of the country, and to do that, they need to drop out before the end of garden leave. Should I decide to continue searching for local positions after garden leave? So any clarification, I think, on that would be helpful. I think the main question is about conversion process, and if someone's caught between the conversion process while someone dependents out of the country, is that an issue?
Yeah, so sorry about that. I was trying to look for the question. The reason why I hesitate a bit here is because I'm not sure about the context behind what you mentioned as gardening leave. So for example, if gardening leave means that during the period of gardening leave, you're still on an employment pass with Google, then the STVP, or the short-term visit pass, only kicks in after the employment pass is rescinded. So if the context in Google is that, so it depends. Gardening leave is you're already on the STVP, then
sorry,
algo comer ahora, vuelven a la 1, vaya
find the
lunch.
person talking and I'll mute this person.
no problem.
Okay, please continue. I've muted the person.
But thanks for the clarification. So if gardening leave is the 90 days after your EP expires, then there's no further extension beyond the 90 days. So instead of thinking about this gardening leave, because I'm mindful that some companies call it gardening leave, but they maintain the employment pass, whereas some companies call it gardening leave, but they've already taken back the employment pass. I think it's better to think about it as the total duration of the short-term visit pass, which is now 90 days and not 30 days. And that's a period of time in which you have to sort out some of your arrangements. And if I'm not wrong, I believe that STVP is also given to the dependents that you had sponsored under your employment pass as well.
So Stephanie, it looks like you raised your hand. Do you have a
Maybe I will. Yeah, maybe I'll clarify. So it would be the period. So the garden leave includes EP. So I guess how fast after the last day of employment does the short-term visitor pass kick in? Like if Google lets the government know on a certain date, is it like immediate? Does it take a week to process? And then if my son was out, like, should I consider anything besides, I know I need to find another job in the short-term visitor pass. I presume he can't come in, I can't leave and he can't come back in. But I just wanted to double check that. But garden leave, there would be an EP present for that period.
Got it. Thanks for that clarification. So if gardening leave means that you still have an employment pass valid, then there's no problem until the end of the employment pass. So there's no problem until the end of gardening leave. My impression, and I'll double check this, but I'm pretty sure that what will happen at the end of your employment pass is that it's automatic that you get a short-term visit pass. So you don't have to apply. What will happen is that the Ministry of Manpower will issue you a short-term visit pass for 90 days. After gardening leave ends, right? After the employment pass expires, you get a short-term visit pass automatically for 90 days. Then the second part of this question is, with the STVP, are you allowed to move in and out of Singapore? And are there other concerns that you might have? On the STVP, I believe you are able to move in and out of Singapore. And I think the Immigration and Checkpoint Authority, or the ICA, is quite facilitative to consider you favorably if you need to come back to Singapore. Now, the question is, should you find short-term employment after that? I think that's entirely up to you. I should highlight that if you do find short-term employment, in order for you to continue to sponsor your dependents, whether they are children or your trading spouse, that short-term employment, which you get another employment pass for, needs to pay a minimum of 6,000 Singapore dollars per month. Because in order to sponsor dependents, the criteria is 6,000 Singapore dollars.
Is there any clarification needed? I know this is an important question. So anyone else wants to unmute to ask related PEP and STVP questions?
Yeah.
And at the same time, I'll trouble my colleagues, Jeff or Jocelyn, if you're in the call, to help me double confirm the point about the short-term visit pass and the multiple entry visa. Thanks.
So Virginia, do you want to ask your question? I think you're unmuted.
Yeah, I just wanted to check. So with PEP, can we work with several employers? Like, for example, if we have the main job and we want to do a side hustle, or is it like EP where we can have only one employer?
Yeah, I believe the PEP has multiple, you can take on multiple roles.
I see.
Hi, sorry. Justin here from EDB. Just
Yes,
wanted to
Justin.
confirm what Sean said. So for PEP, actually freelancing is not allowed. And because you still have to declare your employment to MOM, and there has to be a local point of contact. So I think additional employment can be taken on, but that is subject to MOM's approval. So it's slightly different from, say, the Tech Pass or the One Pass that really allows you to take on multiple roles and multiple employment at the same time. For PEP, I think it's more on a case-by-case basis.
And Jocelyn, just to confirm,
Yeah.
for the case-by-case basis, do they need to apply to MOM, or what should they do if they want to move forward with that?
That's right. So I think there is a declaration form. So you actually have to notify MOM of your employment. And every time you change an employer under the PEP, which is totally allowed, you just have to inform MOM. So within that form, there is a place to tick whether it's a new employment or an additional employment.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Again, I want to open it up again. Any specific questions around this? I know how important this transition is for passes.
Yeah. So I have like a question and a comment. I'm happy to be corrected, but what I've read is that if you're on short-term visit pass, or after the short-term visit pass is granted, if you're outside of Singapore at any point, you can't actually come in. Like, can we confirm that this is not the case? Because this is what I remember reading. then I do have like a follow-up question on the PEP as well.
Yeah, let me confirm that short-term visit pass question with you. I think that the question is whether the short-term visit pass is a single entry visa or multiple entry visa where you can come in and come back again. Let us just confirm that so that you get the factual clarification that you need.
Hi, this is Jeff here from EDB. The short-term visit pass is actually a one-time extended stay program. So it's not meant for multiple entries. So just to clarify, it's really to allow someone to stay for an extended period of time beyond the typical visa periods. So it's a one-time entry and not something that allows multiple entries in and out of the country.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Thanks for clarifying. So to be clear, it's a single entry one-time pass. Thanks, Jeff.
Okay, my follow-up on PEP is that, so I actually applied for PEP before getting the layoff news, and I am laid off, but our garden leave, during which time our EP is still active, is until May 17th. Does the PEP application take into account any additional salaries that we get paid during this time? Hence, it is more likely to get approved. Thank you.
It depends on the point in which you applied for PEP. So if you apply for PEP and you declare a certain salary, that's the basis in which the PEP is assessed. After you to submit to the ministry.
Okay, thank you. Like the assumption is that it stays the base.
Yeah, I must clarify that the PP's salary criteria is based on a fixed monthly salary.
Yes.
So it doesn't take into account bonuses nor other non-fixed benefits that the company may pay out from time to time.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Clear.
So
sorry, Sean, I had a follow-up to that one. So does that even include the severance that we would potentially get towards the total contribution of $144,000?
I suspect it doesn't.
Okay.
Just to answer that question, it will not. It looks at the steady state minimum monthly salary. So to Sean's earlier point on bonuses and severances, because these are, I would say, in some sense, let's call this very bluntly, additional salary on top of the monthly wage. So it's not assessed because the baseline is looking at the monthly baseline salary that someone receives.
Right. Thanks, Jeff.
final questions on this? Any other clarifications needed?
Sorry, I have another question on this. One is that if I haven't yet applied for my PEP, if I do, could I do it by May? So how much time does it take to process? And secondly, is there like I mean, the employment pass is going to expire. My base pay will still be considered, right? And is there a chance of rejection if I'm applying closer to the end of my EP?
I would recommend that you apply as soon as you can. And the reason why I say this is because, as you can imagine, there might be a lot of applications for PEPs coming in last month and this month. And so you want to submit yours as soon as you can, as opposed to waiting to the last moment to apply.
Got it.
And if it's a couple of months, I really recommend you apply earlier, just in case you need more time to factor in any contingencies, including the chance of the Ministry of Manpower not looking so favorably on the application for whatever reason. So you want that early heads up as well. That would be my recommendation.
Okay, and how long does it take? Like usually?
The PP should, to my recollection, should be about the same 3 weeks to a month.
Okay.
Sorry, PEP takes about 6 to 8 weeks, but like Sean mentioned, sorry, this is Jeff here. Like Sean mentioned, if there's an unusually high volume of applications, I do hope there's you guys will also be understanding that if there's an unusual volume of applications in this period, it might take a little bit longer, just because it's the same sort of resources we have to look at these kind of administrative matters. And then if there's a sudden spike, you can expect that there'll take a little bit more time for that. So like Sean mentioned, I think the advice would be, it would be better to do it earlier than later. Yeah, given the current scenario right now.
I think up to 8 months is what the Ministry of Manpower states. But I think rest assured that it's really all hands on deck. So we as government are also investing our resources to process these applications where we can.
Why don't we ask a question that was submitted online, and please, Nick, I know you have your question, but let me ask this one first, since this had quite a few votes, and please upvote any other ones. We are going to run out of time for all the questions, so apologies if your question isn't getting answered. So, Sean, this is regarding the rent. It's increased quite a lot based on Singapore being a place in demand by a lot of people moving here. Can you share more about, for tech workers, especially startup ones, whose comp is equity, not cash, will they be priced out? Any suggestions, any thoughts in terms of what the Singapore government perhaps should be doing or could be doing, and how should someone think about moving to Singapore as an entrepreneur?
Yes, thanks for that. Yeah, in fact, there are a couple of questions here that I can also share more insights about, and I'll be happy to stay a bit longer if you find it useful. On the topic of rent, or more broadly on the topic of cost of living in Singapore, I think you're absolutely right. Singapore is not a low-cost location. It's a high-cost, high-value location, and rent is one of the parameters that we monitor quite closely. I'll share a bit more about my outlook in terms of the rental market. And I'll probably conclude by saying that there's no easy solution except to think of other places in Singapore which could also be places that that your employees can live and work from. But the outlook for the rental market is one where I think in the last 2 years we've seen spiking rents. But going forward, we see some moderation, primarily driven by greater supply of residential units in the next 2 to 3 years. What happened, and maybe for everyone's context, is that our residential building program, both public and private housing, had slowed down quite a bit during COVID. And so the units that were supposed to be in the market in the last 2 years did not come to the market. And now there's a bit of a catch-up building program. And so we anticipate that there will be a lot more supply in the next 2 to 3 years. However, in the near term, and the near term meaning the next 12 months, I foresee the rental market being quite tight, and therefore rents, I know they shot up 50%. Some have told me they shot up 2/3, right, 66%. This would be the new norm, at least going forward for the next 12 months.
So I think there's also different parts of Singapore, right, Sean? Can you recommend parts of Singapore perhaps that still extremely livable, but also perhaps cheaper, and people should consider?
Well, the whole of Singapore is extremely livable, Chris, as you probably know. But I definitely recommend us thinking beyond just the city centre, what we call the core central region, and to look in further areas outside of the city centre, which are still well connected by public transportation to the city centre. And especially if you need your workers or your employees or your startup founders to work remotely, then there's no real necessity to live near the city centre. And different parts of Singapore have their own unique charm and are both accessible as well as well furnished to provide you with what everyone needs for their daily living.
What are the average price of these places outside the central place?
Hi, this is Jeff here. Maybe I could just jump in very quickly. This is really the property market is really driven by, the free market in Singapore. What I would recommend is if you're looking at the various rental prices, Property Guru. Oh yes, I see someone who said it on the chat. Property Guru is a good website that you can sort of benchmark rental costs and based by unit and location across the island. I wanted to add on to what Sean said earlier about how the Singapore government is also making it easier for someone who's living a little further out from the sort of central business district. We've continued to invest in infrastructure, particularly in transportation, to assist with helping our citizens and residents find it more accessible to move around the country. So we recently also announced that there will be a new train station line that will continue to connect a good number of the existing lines there in Singapore. And we've also made announcements over the last few years, the continued investments in the train line that will extend existing lines as well. So the idea that perhaps the newer towns are a little bit further up, they're also very well connected back to the center of the city. So we do try to make sure that even if people feel like they're living a little bit further away, it's still easy and affordable for them to travel across Singapore.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff.
So we're going to go past.
Jeff is my colleague based in the Bay Area. So if you're in the US, and I think about 1/3 of you are in the US, please feel free to connect with him.
We're going to go past the hour, so thank you for folks who are going to stick around. But thanks for Sean to also agree to stick around to answer some more questions. So what do we go to Nick? He's been very patient, raising his hand. Nick, let's go to your.
Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah. All right, sorry, smooth. All right, so I was asking questions that I hope are echoed by some of the Americans who are in this call and considering a move to Singapore. Let me see where these were. I wrote some of these on the dory. First would be about differences in purchasing power, really like, I guess, what should we be expecting in terms of standard of living? And I would say the two other glaring questions I had were with regard to the PEP. So from my understanding, like a typical tech salary could possibly cover a PEP. I think it was like 18,000 Singapore dollars a month.
Yeah.
I know in September it's going to go up to 22,000, which I did the math and it would amount to around 200,000 per year US. Just to like really try and wrap up everything. First off, I guess standard of living difference between a US based software engineer versus someone moving over to Singapore. And then the second would be the salary in terms of the PEP, and if that is something employers in Singapore that are looking abroad to bring in talent are considering. Because the PEP's salary requirement is increasing in September to a quantity that amounts to roughly 200,000 US dollars per year. And that's something that, in terms of a base salary, if you don't account for equity, is not that easy to get unless you're like pretty high up.
Yeah, thanks for that. So Nick, on this question about purchasing power between Singapore and the US, I can answer in general terms, but you probably get a better answer with your Xoogler community, especially those who have lived both in the US and in Singapore. I myself have lived in Chicago for 3 years, but my standard of living was very different both there and in Singapore. So I think, but generally speaking, Singapore is a global city with global prices. I think that's the best way to think about it. And unique differences between, for example, the Bay Area and Singapore, when it comes to rentals, when it comes to food, or when it comes to leisure, I think are best answered by the Xoogler community. And then maybe, Chris, you can share some of those insights either at the call or thereafter. For the PEP question, it's really by design that we decided to increase the salary threshold. Again, this is fixed monthly, so it doesn't include bonuses, doesn't include equity. It's fixed monthly cash. And I do recognize that when the salary threshold goes up, it gets a bit more difficult. And by design, Singapore is open, but we also have to be selective because we are a very small city and a very small country. And so that's the bar in which we are setting, above which you can get a PEP. Of course, you can still come into Singapore below the bar of 22,500, but that would be on an employer-sponsored employment pass. And on that note, maybe right at the end, I'll also share a bit more about the labor market in Singapore as well as the prospects for the tech sector.
No, that's perfect.
Yeah,
thank you. I think a lot of people are going to want that.
Yeah, okay. So I think a lot of the questions in the last half an hour were around like the passes we have in Singapore, what to do after your employment pass expires, and how to basically come to Singapore, right, to work. What I think I wanted to touch on also the situation in the economy in Singapore in the short term as well as the long term, and specifically the labor market pertaining to tech employees like yourselves. So the situation is that I think Singapore is very much a global city, and so we are affected by global trends. That includes the recent trend of tech companies right-sizing and cost-cutting. But at the same time, there are some unique circumstances to Singapore that are not the same as other jurisdictions. The first one is that our labor market, comprising of Singaporeans, has plateaued because Singapore is a small country and our population is aging. So every year, the number of Singaporeans entering the workforce is now about the same as the number of Singaporeans that are exiting the workforce. And because of that, the number of Singaporeans that can go into these jobs will increase over time, but increase at a slow rate. Now, what this means is that our labor market remains tight, and that over the long term, there'll be many, many more opportunities for us to see our local Singaporean talent working alongside global talent. And because the labor market is tight, it follows then that for many people with the required skill sets, they should be able to find another job quite easily. In fact, in the short term, what my colleagues at the EDB have noticed since maybe the fourth quarter of last year is that many tech workers have actually found alternative sources of employment in Singapore. And this covers all types of functions, not just software engineering, but also corporate functions as well. In the short term, beyond the tech companies, there are certain areas of Singapore that are still scaling up. And this includes other sectors of the economy for which we require tech professionals. I think my colleague Jeff had linked Chris up with some of our companies that are still hiring. A large group would be from the finance sector, because fintech is one area in which we are doubling down on. The Singapore government is also hiring a certain number of top-tier software engineers through our open government products team that looks at solving public policy-related problem statements. And then other pockets of hiring across Singapore. So the job market and economy in Singapore is not one where it's all doom and gloom. In fact, we are cautiously optimistic, especially over some other sectors. So the short-term picture is not rosy by any measure, but neither is it one where we feel like there are no opportunities. Then in the medium term, in the 3 to 5 year horizon, that's where we see structural tailwinds for the tech sector. Because ultimately, Singapore as a tech nation is a digital first type of economy that we're trying to create. So the opportunities that we see going forward on the demand side would be significant in the next 3 to 5 year period, notwithstanding the current climate. So there'll still be a shortage of tech professionals in 3 years and 5 years. We still see the need for companies to hire aggressively in that time frame. And we are also increasing the pipeline of Singaporean talents that can also contribute to the sector. So that's just the broader picture that I hope to share today also, to give you a sense about not just the next 3 to 5 months, but really the next 3 to 5 years, so that you can make the informed decision, not just about your time here working for an employer, but maybe founding a business, founding a startup, and growing from Singapore.
So maybe I'll chime in, Sean, in terms of specifics. So I was in Singapore for a week. Before that, I flew in from San Francisco, and I could judge the climate on both sides. And clearly, in the Bay Area in the US, there's still a lot of hiring. Clearly, Google and Meta may not be hiring as much. But you think about companies specifically in Singapore. Virginia was telling me about some recruiters and some tech companies that are actually looking to join our job fair and panel next week. As Sean was mentioning, Jeff has actually introduced us to some banks and also Food Panda and other folks that are hiring. Netflix is hiring, Grab is hiring over here. And also there was a Xoogler who saw a post that we had of different Googlers who were impacted that were gathering on Saturday in a part of Singapore at a cafe, and EG joined, and he was saying that he's actually hiring for 60 roles in Singapore. And it's just not software engineering roles, it's actually across the board. So Singapore is hiring. And I think part of it is check out the Xoogler job board, ask us for introductions. In fact, someone who works on TikTok also mentioned that there's different types of recruiters that if you're looking to work with TikTok, they are actively hiring too. So I would say that even though there are some companies aren't hiring in Singapore, a lot of them are actively hiring, would love to hire ex-Googlers. So David, I think you have a question probably around this line. So David, you want to ask your question? And please unmute yourself. Thank you.
I thought I did. Sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Yes.
Okay, great. It's a question / comment. I think that in the past 2 to 3 years, we've seen an increase in compensation level offered to candidates. And I don't know if this has been addressed. I joined the call late. But maybe is there some trend that has been identified from the government side in terms of compensation trend, maybe lowering because there was a high demand in the past, but now that demand has the market has softened a little bit, and therefore, and maybe for everyone on the call to be realizing that, I don't know, setting expectation, touching a subject that could be a little bit difficult. The same compensation that you had 2 years ago when you joined may not be the same that you will have moving forward. Is there any comments from our vision in terms of that or information about that? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think in general, the answer is yes. We do see some salary corrections, especially amongst the workforce that has quite a few years of work experience as the labor market weakens. But as I mentioned earlier, the labor market weakening doesn't mean the labor market is weak. I think in Singapore, the labor market remains quite tight and quite strong. So just 2 days ago, we published our graduate employment survey results. And admittedly, this is a few months outdated, but a few months ago, our graduates, fresh graduates with no work experience, saw a salary increase of more than 10% compared to the year ago. And to put it in dollar terms, our fresh graduates coming out from our local universities, NUS and NTU, were earning something close to 5,500 per month as a fresh graduate. And that sort of gives a signal in terms of how strong the labor market remains as of third quarter last year. Since then, yes, it has softened quite a bit. I do expect salary expectations to come down slightly. It would probably be for those with a few more years of work experience, maybe 5, 10 years of work experience, where the conversations would be a bit more difficult if you're talking to a new company who wants to hire you.
Jeff here, I wanted to chime in on what Sean mentioned as well. I also wanted to paint a picture for everyone here on Singapore's economy. I know a lot of you and all of you are in tech. Tech accounts for approximately 12% of Singapore's economy. Manufacturing accounts for about 20%. So if we want to look at the variety of what we have in Singapore, there are actually quite varied groups of industries in Singapore. And what we're seeing right now is a general correction from US big tech. We continue to see growth in the tech sector from other parts of the world, a little bit from North Asia, a little bit from Europe. We also see a lot of rebounding that's happening in the manufacturing sector and in areas where they're looking to digitize their operations, right? So we do see the manufacturing community, which is 20% of Singapore's GDP, that they are looking out for software engineers and people that can help build up systems that have digitized their products. That being said, I do want to manage expectations. I think the general trend is that salaries are going up, but I do have to admit that US big tech is one of the better paying employees around the world. So if you're looking at the general trend, if you're specifically from big tech, I think there might be a little bit of a dip in terms of salary expectations at this juncture. Yeah.
Thank you for the clarification.
So Jeff, maybe you can also continue talking about the opportunities for folks to get support that are looking to start a company. I know Pooja had the question and quite a few people are looking to perhaps start companies. Whether it's you or Sean, could you give an outline of what are the different types of support services, but also VC funds, but also communities that people should look at if they're looking to, oh, maybe I should go to Singapore to start a company. I know Singapore has different support services.
Sure. So maybe let me just paint a picture like Sean started at the start of this conversation. And this is something that we're looking at for maybe the next decade or so. Southeast Asia as a whole is 650 million people. That's approximately double the population size of the US. And given as what has happened over the last 3 to 5 years, we've seen a lot of investments flow in from the US and North Asia down into Southeast Asia. And that is starting to increase median income across the board. So what we see is a growing opportunity for the future, a growing pool of disposable income, and also one of the world's youngest populations around the world. The populations in Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia are all very young. And they're also very digitally native, which means that for a tech company, there's certainly a lot of opportunities to build a company in Singapore to cater for the Southeast Asian market. Now, the other part about it is, and this is something that I gathered from a event not too long ago in Singapore. Actually, a founder from Indonesia mentioned this, and he said, actually, the systems in Southeast Asia, there are still a lot of holes in them, which means if you're a founder, there's a lot of business opportunities to build products and make lives a lot better for the citizens across Southeast Asia, right? So we see this as an opportunity for people. In the landscape of Singapore, we have a good number of VCs, not just from the US, but also local VCs and VCs from China. So we see ourselves as an area where capital can flow from different parts of the world. The likes of your Sequoia, your GGV, your 500 Global, they're all in Singapore, as well as Plug and Play. At the same time, you might have venture firms like Hillhouse Capital that's from China, and you also have local VC firms like Monk's Hill Capital that's from Singapore. So all these, you have a variety of people that you can work with, and also a variety of where capital is coming from. So maybe that can give a little bit of background about Singapore's landscape. Additionally, and I think this number will change, but currently we have 700 family offices in Singapore, not just from Southeast Asia, but from North Asia, the US, and Europe. And what we're hoping that would do in the future is that will funnel in more private capital into venture, and that will slowly feed into the rest of the startups that are within our ecosystem. So I'll take a pause here. I don't want to just cannibalize this moment. But yeah, I'll take a pause here if there are any questions.
Sure, this is very helpful, Jeff. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. In fact, learning about the Singapore startup ecosystem can be a whole event on itself. But Jeff really did a good summary in the last 5 minutes. Are there any other last questions that you think Jeff, Jocelyn, Chris, and myself can be helpful with?
I think we have
No, I think I would just like to say thank you so much, Chris, Sean, and Jeff. Very, very thoughtful of you to put this together and hugely helpful. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Yeah, Chris, any last words from you?
No, I think that's it, Nick. It better be a good question if you have a final question, Nick. Maybe we can unmute. Maybe I'll answer Nick's question directly. Nick, you're still on mute, but thanks for everyone for joining. We're 20 minutes past the hour already, so we had a lot of great content, both from Sean, Jeff, and also clarification from Jocelyn. So thank you to the EDB for sharing these comments and what can be a stressful situation for a lot of Googlers who are impacted, but also people looking to move to Singapore to explore new opportunities. We'll share more details on Slack and other things that will be useful for people looking to move to Singapore. And so thanks again for joining the Xoogler community, but also to our guests from EDB. We'll see everyone very soon.
Yeah, thank you guys. It's been great. If I can remember to unmute my headset and on Zoom.